Okay. Hello. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for being here. Of course, it's a pleasure to speak in this place and right now in this conference, but also especially after Tristan's extraordinary exploration of the history and analysis of science fiction up to today. And to a certain extent, I will continue that exploration from today onwards. Originally, I was meant to speak about something else completely. I write about metaphysics and especially about the end of worlds, apocalypses. But in reality, as you heard, as Martin said, I actually work in a publishing house. So when I think about science fiction, I think about it first of all as a publisher. My publishing house publishes books on politics, philosophy, mostly politics. But we also have a line of fiction. Now, you can imagine that for a house that's been publishing non-fiction only for 40 years, starting to publish fiction starts a lot of debates. And of course, the publishing house is also a business. So most of our debates are editorial, but also commercial. But since we are a strange publisher, so we are political, there are also interesting debates in terms of politics. To what extent can we justify publishing fiction if we are a political publisher, for example? What room is there for fiction in political thinking? But also philosophical points. How can you make a real distinction between fiction and non-fiction? As you can imagine, we see also a lot of science fiction. So I will now begin by looking a little bit how we can think about the difference between fiction and non-fiction. And as you can see, we'll then move to discuss science fiction. The distinction fiction, non-fiction is easy, obviously, no? Non-fiction is that thing which talks about what actually happens in the world out there. It can also be immaterial things like mathematics. It's about nature, so it's about an objective reality. And it uses a particular tool. It uses descriptive language. So a kind of language that tries to capture, to link back, to reference precisely something out there in the world. The essence of descriptive language used to be the word. The word is that machine that captures something. You know, through the word you also in magic you used to have this. Through the word you capture something and you substitute it with the word. Now we call it data. So non-fiction is beyond just publishing. Non-fiction is part of a general way of accounting for the reality of the world out there. Fiction also is easy to define. Fiction is about what is not actually out there, what doesn't actually happen. What is not out there, perhaps what is in here, in the mind, is not about nature, but it is fundamentally about artifice. It is about the act of creating realities. The tool of fiction is not descriptive language. The tool of fiction is style. Style comes from from stilus, the Latin word for that chopstick that you use to draw on wax or on clay. So it's the instrument through which you make forms emerge from a situation where you have no forms. That's what the tool of fiction. And the essence of fiction is not the word, interestingly, is not data, of course. It is what Henri Corbin used to call, after Ibn Arabî, the creative imagination. In the work of Ibn Arabî, one of the greatest European intellectuals of all time, being Spanish, Andalusian. He was a Muslim metaphysician and mystic and many more things. God himself, or itself, or themselves, creates reality as an act of the mind through the use of a creative imagination. And the essence of style is a creation through an act of the mind, almost godlike. So this is a distinction, it's very simple. But there is a problem. There is a weak spot in this distinction, and I'm sure that you've guessed it, the weak spot is non-fiction. It's a difficult concept, but also is a very weak concept. The problem is that non-fiction, to exist, to be something that makes sense, to say we can speak about an external world in a way that is meaningful, requires a series of conditions to take place. The first condition, and you see all of them are pretty complicated. The first condition that it requires is that there is something outside of our mind. The first condition that we need to accept right now, even just to treat each other as real beings, is we have to postulate that we exist, that you actually are not just an hallucination that I'm having right now. This is basic, and we don't think about it, of course, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to live. But it's philosophically undemonstrable. I cannot demonstrate the existence of anything outside of the mind. The second condition which it requires has to do with epistemology and perceptions in particular. It is necessary that when I perceive you as separate individuals, I'm actually perceiving something which is naturally, objectively separate and individual. So my perception of things has to correspond to the reality objectively of the world out there. Is that the case? We cannot say. The third condition which is necessary to be capable of speaking of non-fiction in general is that the language through which we think, the concepts, we think linguistically through concepts mostly, these concepts then correspond, not only correspond, but truly represent the things which are out there in the world, which truly exist, which we perceive correctly, which we can translate correctly into concepts, and then finally, which we translate into a language and we communicate it. We write non-fiction about it. And this language has to be capable of substituting itself to the object without any real loss of information. So when we operate on language, it is the same as when we operate on the world. This sounds like a technical point, but it's not. Think of the massive investments in big data, for example. Massive investments in big data make sense because philosophically they imply that operating on data is the same as operating on the world. So that when you operate on data, you demonstrate that a person has a 99% likelihood of committing a crime tomorrow, he should be arrested. This requires not only all the 3 points that I've said before, but also this fourth one, that we can substitute language for the things. Now, believing that all these conditions actually take place, it's a massive investment in belief. They must simultaneously take place, all of them, to be able to speak about non-fiction, that is to speak about a real world out there of which we can speak truthfully and objectively. So what makes non-fiction a weak concept is not just that we have different opinions, is that it requires a metaphysical idea which is simply very unlikely to be the case. It is extremely unlikely that the specific intelligence, which is the human intelligence, the specific concepts through which we speak, the specific perceptive apparatus that we have, coincide with absolute reality as it actually is. So what do we know instead? So if this is not the case. I'm not saying that it's not the case. I'm saying that it is a massive investment in belief. It's like believing in the flying spaghetti monster. So believing something that could be the case, but it's unlikely. What do we know instead? The first thing and the only thing that we know is that we are aware. We are aware, and we know this because we don't think that we are aware. Awareness is what we are. Awareness is precisely our existence. Our existence is as an awareness. Awareness this is not a solution to the problem like Descartes. It's not saying cogito ergo sum, because cogito, I think, therefore I am. I think. So it's personal. Thinking is personified. Awareness is pre-personal. There is awareness, and this awareness is aware of something. It might be also the awareness of my own existence. So this pre-personal awareness is something closer, not to Descartes' cogito, but to what in Hinduism you called Âtman. It is that thing within you which says I when you say I. It is the thing within you which thinks when you think. The thing within you that hears when you hear. That's in the Chandogya Upanishad, that's how they describe the Âtman. Awareness. So we are aware, but we are aware of something. It might be an hallucination, who cares? But we are aware of something. And this something comes to us as an undivided wave of perceptions, as a raw reality that invests us all together. Right in this moment, this is investing me all simultaneously. And on this, I operate cuts and divisions. I separate the distances, I separate the objects, I separate the moments in time. I create an order out of this avalanche. I create an order out of chaos. I make a cosmos, in Greek, order. Also beautiful. So we know that we are an awareness which is invested by a wave of perception. We know that we order this perception in cosmoi, so in orders. And we also know that different people order the world differently, to the point that different societies have created worlds very differently. Imagine being in medieval Europe, right here in the 12th century. It's not only that you would see a different landscape, you would live in a physically different world. For example, where there is God and there are souls. And the person you're speaking with and yourself are part of a divine plan. This is not just an opinion. This is part of the way in which you create reality. All these different ways are possible. And they're all arbitrary, because they don't rely on anything prior, anything before it. So, if we describe our making of reality like this, then the world, the cosmos in which we live, is the product of our artifice. And since it is the product of our artifice, of our activity of world making, then that world of which we want to write non-fiction is in itself a fiction, to a certain, at least to a certain extent. So the problem here is, sorry, I'm keeping an eye on the time because I don't want to go over. Okay. Yeah. So the point here is that the concept of non-fiction is very weak, and the idea which it requires is untenable. And yet, why do we still stick with it? And not only why do we stick with it, but why do we have to stick with it? Why should we stick with it? And with ideas, to a certain extent, we need to stick with non-fiction ideas, such as the fact that there is a world, that it is there, that we can speak about it somehow, that there is something close to truth or something close to nature. There are facts, there is history, all these non-fiction ideas. We need to stick with them. Why? But not because they're true, obviously, but because pragmatically we need these things. We need these things pragmatically because they provide something to the only thing which we know for certain that exists, awareness. Having an idea that there is an objective world out there provides awareness with a world, with a navigable landscape which makes sense and which we can navigate. If we were to renounce to non-fiction, we would be deprived of the world. And being deprived of the world is possible, but it's usually the job of the mystics, and it's a very difficult job. It's not for everyone, certainly not for me. So non-fiction is very important, and the non-fiction world is very important to keep. But in recent decades, we have seen that the non-fiction world is going through very difficult and serious problems. We are facing an environmental crisis and an ecocide. We were talking earlier about the clock ticking. But also we are witnessing an unprecedented proliferation of nuclear weapons, which is not often discussed as an emergency, but it is a real emergency, especially in a multipolar world. Widespread impoverishment, creation of a new oligarchy, inequalities on an incredible scale, daily massacre of migrants, epidemics of psychopathologies, and so on and so forth. We have all these non-fiction problems, but we cannot tackle them. We seem unable to find a way to resolve them. Not even just resolve, of approaching them to a certain extent. So what is happening is that the non-fiction world, as my publishing house, is starting to look into the fiction world to find solutions. So we look into science fiction, for example, to find solutions. And what is happening also in return is that fiction is responding to these requests. And is responding by becoming compatible with non-fiction. For example, by becoming speculative. So trying to provide, fiction tries to provide, especially mainstream science fiction nowadays, tries to provide solutions to the non-fiction problems. Think of so-called dystopian science fiction, Squid Game, Black Mirror, the predictions of the future. It tries to provide some solutions. It tries to make itself non-fiction compatible. So what we have at the moment is, it seems, a colonization of the fiction world from the non-fiction world, which subjects it to its own projects and its own problems. But even though we have an incredible amount of science fiction everywhere, from the tiny to the super mainstream, we seem to be unable to tackle these problems. So we seem to be unable still to find a solution to all the things that I was saying earlier. Why? Well, the problem is not that we don't have the means to tackle environmental crisis, widespread impoverishment, inequality, the proliferation of nuclear weapons, the massacre of migrants. And we could resolve all this immediately. We have the technical means to do this. So perhaps we need ideas. We need to find new ideas in science fiction. No, we have them. We know exactly what to do. The environmental crisis is a case in point. We have precisely a roadmap of what to do. So we know we could do it, and we know exactly what we should do. So why are we not doing it? This is a familiar experience for anyone, like myself, for example, who have ever suffered from depression or from addictions. You know exactly what you should do to get better. In theory, you should have the means to do it, yet it's completely impossible. It seems entirely pointless. And this is, I think, the point. The problem is that we cannot see why we should do it. It is as if there was no point in doing anything, as if in our non-fiction engagement with the world, in the world itself and our presence within it, just didn't make any sense. As if there was a case of collective impotence in front of a general lack of sense of reality. Now, when I say sense, I speak about a word that we use a lot, but I don't think we always examine in terms of what it actually means. Now, what does it actually mean? It's impossible to say. So I will propose a way of understanding what is sense by opposing it with meaning. This is a typical philosophical way. Now, you create these dichotomies to explain the two terms. This is not, by the way, for whoever is interested in philosophy of language, the way in which Gottlob Frege discussed this in Sense and Reference, which is the standard way of understanding sense. Anyway, so sense as different from meaning. What is meaning? Meaning is what you find in definitions. Mathematics is the science of numbers. So mathematics, the meaning of the term mathematics is the science of numbers. Meaning, fundamentally, and I think this is an important point, meaning is what you find in a dictionary, where every word refers to other words. When you have a dictionary, you don't need anything else. In the dictionary, every definition is composed by other words that you find in the dictionary. And the meaning of words is created by this internal cross-reference within the book. So meaning works like an allegory, allos agorein in Greek, to speak about something else, but not something else, to speak something else within the common game board of language itself. So meaning is expressed in this internal reference. And non-fiction, it's all about creating meaning. So it's all about creating internal references of language in which every bit corresponds to another bit and explains it. Information technology works through meaning. You create bits and you reference them together in a way that everything corresponds to something else, and then you have something. But more clearly, I think, conspiracy theories work through meaning. They might not make sense, but if you look at them, they are perfectly meaningful internally, obsessively so. Okay, so they have a game board in which it operates in this particular way, and everything refers to everything else and explains it meaningfully. So that's meaning. What is sense, if this is meaning? Sense you don't find usually in definitions, so you don't find it in words. You find it in sentences, at least. Let's say the minimal fragment where you find sense is not in words, it's in sentences. This is the way in which, for example, sense was understood in Hindu grammatology at the time of our late antiquity. In India, Bhartrihari, a very important grammarian, came out with a theory of a thing called sphota, which means that that the sense of things can be found only at the level of the sentence, not at the level of the word. That's the minimum. You find it also in Walter Otto, which sustains a very similar position, that meaning is found in the sentences. You find it in Paul Ricoeur, which says that the metaphor operates at the level of the sentence, not at the level of the word. So I'm just positioning where we are. Okay. Sense is not what you find in a dictionary. A dictionary is full of meaning, makes absolutely no sense. Sense is what you find in a novel. And you find it in a novel precisely because to understand a novel, it's not sufficient to look at all the other words in the book. You need to look outside of the book. I remember reading The Return of Casanova, and I was struck by how the author is capable of creating this incredible novel by giving these very sparse references to the landscape and the things. And it is precisely in the gaps, in what is not in the book, that I could project, for example, my own emotions, my memories, and the world came alive in what it was not in the text. So, sense works not like an allegory, allos agorein, speaking about something else, but it works like a symbol. These are two words that we often, I think, mix together. A symbol is something that points to something outside of its own field. An allegory, for example, is you want to represent strength, you put a lion in a painting. Strength is a concept, very clearly defined. You find an image that links back to it. A symbol is something that links to something completely outside of language. And so the symbol has nothing to do with it. A lion represents strength because it's very strong. A symbol is something that leads to something entirely outside of the book. For example, when you go into a Byzantine church and you see gold in the background, which refers to the mystery of existence in itself, what is called grace in a Christian understanding. This is what you find in fiction and what you find in poetry, typically. These are the kind of literary forms that are most endowed with sense, not always with meaning, but with sense. Because fiction and poetry are about opening sense, creating sense, precisely because they are about style. Remember earlier, fiction and non-fiction. So they're about that process which makes a world emerge from a situation in which there was no world, and that makes a form emerge from a situation in which there were no forms. Let me give you an example of a notion which is meaningless, although it makes sense. Life. Life is a good example of the kind of thing which is imbued with sense because it refers to something which is outside of our possibilities of describing precisely what it is, and yet is meaningless precisely because we cannot locate it exactly within the dictionary. This also accounts for the reason why we're having such difficulties to handling the problem of life at the moment. At the same time, we find it everywhere, and also we respect it nowhere, is that particular combination. So, to recapitulate halfway through, okay? I'm suggesting that the reason of our impotence to resolve or fix or at least tackle non-fiction problems is that we cannot see why we should do what we know we should do and we would have the means to do. It's a problem of sense, I'm saying. It is as if our big story, the non-fiction account of the world, reality as we think it actually is, was no longer connected with anything outside of its own narration, like a dictionary, entirely closed onto itself. Now, this makes it internally meaningful, but makes it completely devoid of sense. Because sense, as I was saying, is created through a relationship with what is outside of the narration, outside of the conceptualization. As Heidegger points in terms of life, for example, an authentic life is a life towards death, in the sense that it is created its own meaning, its own sense, by a relationship with what exceeds it. But nothing exceeds the world of non-fiction, it seems today. Non-fiction is colonizing even fiction. So what we have is we have a world that is a non-fictionality, a non-fiction, which is so strong that it's entirely closed onto itself, and a place where everything is meaningful and nothing makes sense. Like Joseph Brodsky used to say in Lullaby of Cape Cod, everything works, only the human no longer does. So, one second. To get back some sense or a connection with something outside of its own text, the real world of nonfiction could allow the world of fiction to come in wildly and to open an opening onto the outside. But what it's doing instead, it's colonizing the world of nonfiction in the mode of extraction. So it's looking into it in order to mine it for ideas, to mine it for predictions, to mine it for solutions, new perspectives, and so on and so forth. And fiction, it seems, to a great extent, is taking on this offer, this poisonous offer, and is adapting itself. It's enough to look at Netflix, especially mainstream nonfiction, especially science fiction, I have to say. So what you have is things that try to provide solutions within the language of nonfiction, or to offer some minor twists on nonfiction ideas. Harry Potter, annihilation, and so on and so forth. Minor variations, as if no other world was truly possible. Yes, it's possible to variate something about our idea of nonfiction, of the real world, but not fundamentally. Just small twists. An alien comes, a new dimension or something. So it seems that in the same moment in which the fiction is put on a pedestal to present it as the source of our solutions, at the same moment is depleted and desertified completely. And this is something that we know. I mean, it's a typical tendency of contemporary times. This is what happened with work and leisure, if you remember correctly. In the last few decades, it has been the case that leisure itself has been put to work in service of work. So I remember surreal situations in London in particular, in which there were rave parties at 5 a.m., so you would get to the office refreshed. So you have a situation in which leisure is instrumental to work, and the result, as I used to say, work hard, play hard. And the result is, first of all, an impoverishment and disintegration of fun and leisure, with a worsening of the current epidemics of psychopathologies, obviously. And on the other hand, a complete disengagement from the idea of work, which feels entirely pointless. It was already pointless in a capitalist environment, now it's entirely pointless. Also because it's entirely disconnected with anything outside of it. And you require the harshest blackmail, as it happens at the moment, get back to work or else, to be able to get people back to work. So I'm suggesting to consider that nonfiction requires a vital connection with something outside of itself. The realm of fiction could provide this, but it seems that at the moment it's being colonized and extracted to such an extent that it's unable to do it. And so, where do we look? And to conclude, and I think, well, we got time, okay, so to get to the conclusion, where else can we look for some true fiction, so to say? So something which is capable of opening our world and our idea of reality to something that is truly disconnected, radically outside, other to nonfiction, to the real world, to what we think, as we were saying at the beginning, is not the real world, is what we think is the real world. So something that opens to that ineffable, unspeakable source, which is the source of sense, typically. I think, and I'm suggesting here, briefly, of course, to consider two places, and I suggest just to consider looking at them in further depth. I won't have the time to explain and discuss them at length now. To look into two places that don't have very much to do with science fiction proper, but that could provide what science fiction is expected to be capable of providing and is unable to provide at the moment, it seems. These two places have to do the first with texts and practices, and the second with policy and politics. The first one is a bit, as Tristan was mentioning about the metaphysicians of early modernity, is located into the past, and antiquity in particular, but not anything ancient. I'm suggesting to consider looking with the same eye with which we look at as non-fiction, so with the same desire to find something, to mythological texts and mystical theologies in particular. But a few disclaimers are necessary here to avoid repeating the same mistake. First, we should not just look at them in the way in which a Victorian anthropologist walks through a village in Central Africa, okay? So with a horrible anthropological look in which we catalog the curiosity of antiquity, of the strange people that lived before us. We should take them seriously. Taking them seriously means suspending our disbelief in the same way in which we suspend our disbelief towards the idea of reality, which is typical of westernized modernity, which becomes real to us because of our investment in suspending our disbelief towards it. This doesn't mean, second disclaimer, to mock them, as in to create fake religious pseudo-mythological things. We shouldn't have an urgency to immediately add to what's already being done. Maybe later. But to start, we should study them. Once again, not just as scholars or anthropologists, but as disciples. And it's a completely different understanding, taking them on as lenses. For example, when we read Homer or Greek mythology, let's imagine, as Tristan would say, let's imagine that was not just literature. Let's imagine that, as Walter Otto says, there was actually a non-fiction description of the world as it actually is. A possibility that we can embrace now and take on as a pair of glasses through which we see the world as it actually is now. So in this way, we would take that as an instrument that would intervene at the fundamental level of our making reality, rather than later as an interesting critical thing. Let's try to imagine to do the same, for example, with Aboriginal mythologies, with Amazonian cosmologies, with Semitic or Hindu myths of creation, and so on and so forth. These texts, the mythological, mystical texts, are not just texts, and also they're very different, mythological and mystical. We could discuss that at length later if you like. But they are positions towards worlding. So they are attitudes through which you create the world, but they are particular attitudes because they always recognize that the world is open, is incomplete, is open to something beyond it. It's open to the outside. And in a religious, mystical especially, and mythological sense, the world makes sense precisely because this is not the whole of reality. It is a thin dimension. It's a particular dimension in which reality manifests itself as a world, which is valid, but it's very, very small. In this attitude, it doesn't make sense to speak about what's beyond the world, at least not descriptively. The point is not to do that. The point is not to describe what's beyond the world, and especially the point is not to bring the other world into the world. That's what fundamentalists typically do, to turn divine law into secular law. This is a typical mistake, philosophical mistake of fundamentalists. The point is that from within the world, from within our beloved non-fiction, which we need, it is necessary to acknowledge the presence of something which is beyond it. Acknowledge it and contemplate it. So in Greek, theorizing it. Fundamentally theorizing what's totally otherworldly. The point here is not to mine, to extract from mythologies, to extract from mystical texts solutions to our problems in the same way that we have devastated science fiction, for example. I think that the point is to do a movement. First, to abandon our idea of non-fiction reality, then to move out of our particular cosmos, then to traverse the outside where there is no meaning, and then to migrate to other cosmoi, and then to return into non-fiction. More than cosmonauts, like psychonauts. Now, if you remember as children reading fables, you see that this is exactly the path of a fable. In fables, the hero goes through precisely this journey. First by losing their world, kicked out of the house, then by losing themselves, losing their identity, losing everything, losing even their life, entering the forest, and then coming back. So a similar idea of losing our world, our closed discourse of non-fiction, losing ourselves, ideas of navigation and identity, traveling through foreign worlds And the problem here is not cultural appropriation, but the problem really is the ability to become foreign to your own world so fundamentally that it is possible to enter, to migrate, not to enter, but to migrate into different worldviews, to get acquainted with death, with the intermundum, like with the thing in between the worlds, and then to re-enter with a different understanding, like the hero of the fables typically re-enters at the end, and then the spring comes back to life and there's water again, or the tree blossoms again. So this is the first thing into the past, which I'm suggesting to look at to fix that situation, which we try to fix with science fiction. The second thing I'm suggesting to consider is not in the past, but in the present, and doesn't have to do with texts, or to a certain extent, but with the text of policies and politics. Our non-fiction world, especially in westernized modernity, which is not just Europe, westernized modernity you find in many different places, and it's enforced at the border between India and Bangladesh, for example, or in the commercial districts of Bangkok, and so on and so forth. Our westernized modern world would benefit immediately in terms of sense from the arrival of migrant others from between the borders of its own world, and the practical disintegration of any rigid world form. Now, not a policed arriving out of other people as long as an unpoliced arrival, an unmitigated, unmediated arrival of different worlds into one's own world with their own notions of non-fiction, without attempting to regulate it, abandoning claims of property to territories. If you enter Britain, you enter a certain culture, or you enter a certain thing which is property of a certain non-fiction story, and you have to respect it. I'm not sure because, okay, because that's the property of that. And opening it with the precise idea of shattering the closeness of our particular idea of reality. So not asking or encouraging other worlds to come into our own in order to integrate them, as usually is the idea here in France, to reduce them all to one. Or not even to ghettoize them, to turn them into multicultural ghettos, where everybody is clean and separate, as they do in the UK. But let's say in the Ottoman way, as in to syncretize them, to reunite them to produce a disfigurement of different ideas of reality and worlds, and a recombination in which at the end, it's unclear precisely what comes where and who owns it fundamentally. So, to close for real, what I'm suggesting is that what we are looking for in science fiction, we probably won't find in the speculative futures of science fiction. But we could find it in the past of mythological and mystical wisdom, and we could find it in the present of migrations, especially if allowed to traverse the world wildly. And it's interesting to speak about this here, in Arles and on the shores of the Mediterranean. Unfortunately, I speak in English because I live in England. I'm not English myself. But here on the shores of the Mediterranean, this has happened before. This has happened many times before. That in situations of crisis, when the world seemed to be imploding fundamentally, and the challenges of the non-fiction world were unfixable, the answer was, well, for example, right here, as in physically here in the 12th century, to create new worlds. The Jewish community did it when they invented the Kabbalah. Exactly right here, before and after that particular time here in Provence, is to resolve the difficulty of life together by inventing a form of courteous poetry in which love is divine and divinity is love. French writers learned from Ibn Hazm and the Arabic school to create this absolutely syncretic understanding of love as something entirely otherworldly, and the otherworldly as entirely connected within the present. But in general, you find it throughout the history of the Mediterranean. This is the typical Mediterranean way of responding to a situation in which the non-fiction world no longer makes sense. It has problems which will be resolvable. Think of the end of the Roman Empire. The problems were resolvable. We had a state of civil war for 200 years. If we hadn't had that, things would have gone differently, and yet. And the answer is usually to look back into the past, and specifically in the past of what they call ancient wisdoms, which are usually fictional. They're invented, like the Chaldean oracles, like Hermes Trismegistus, to allow them back in, to reuse them to disintegrate the confines of the world, and then to integrate them with bits from everywhere. You find it in all the amazing late ancient inventions of the Mediterranean world are made exactly like this. They are undefinable. You find it also before in Hellenism, the figure of Alexander the Great has become everything. But the great religions of late antiquity were like this. And through this particular thing, they managed to set the foundations for a new sense of sense and for a new sense of world. And to quip on the title of the talk of the conference, to a certain extent, that was the reality of their fiction, which was more real than any non-fiction and more daring, certainly, than science fiction. Thank you for your patience.